Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today, today, I want to talk about trauma, fragmentation, and the need for certainty. In other words, I'm going to explore how trauma leads to fragmentation in the brain, and then I'll explain what our brain does in response to the terror of fragmentation. So first, what is fragmentation and how does trauma cause fragmentation in the brain? Okay, when you experience something, your brain records memory in many areas, but 5 that I want to focus on, highlight 5 key areas. Your brain records your thoughts about the experience, your feelings about the experience, the physical sensations you had during the experience. That's number 3. The bodily inclinations you felt in the midst of the experience. And number 5, the visual images of what you saw during the experience with your eyes. So there are more areas of memory, smell, for example, but these 5 will suffice to illustrate my point for today. Thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, bodily inclinations, in other words, the instinct to move in a particular way, and visual images. Okay, those are 5 areas where your brain records memory. So let's make this practical. Consider the following example. Suppose when you are 7 years old, you're having fun playing at a park when suddenly a golden retriever rushes at you and bites you. Your mother's on the other side of the playground and she can't get to you in time to protect you from the dog. Here's what happens in your brain. As the dog gets close, you see an image of the dog's angry face. That image is stored in one part of your brain. At the same time, you feel the emotion of fear as the dog is charging at you. That emotion gets stored in a different part of your brain. At the same time, you feel a tightening in your chest and an increase in your heart rate. Your memory of those physical sensations gets stored in yet a different part of your brain. At the same time, your body has an inclination to turn away from the dog and run. That bodily memory of wanting to turn away and run, that inclination towards movement, that is stored in yet another part of your brain. One more. At the same time. In other words, all of these you're experiencing these layers of memory concurrently. At the same time, thoughts. You think to yourself, a scary dog is charging at me. Okay, that thought gets stored in yet a different part of your brain. Each of these different kinds of memory are recorded in your brain at the same time, but in different brain locations. You are experiencing emotions, thoughts, and physical sensations, plus you're seeing images, plus you're having bodily impulses to move in a particular way. Now, in a non-threatening experience, all right, unlike the bite from the dog, in a non-threatening experience, all of these different kinds of memory would connect with one another. Okay, the neurons would be sufficiently connected. And that's called integration. So in a non-threatening experience, your thoughts, your emotions, your bodily sensations, everything, the neurons recording those memories would be very well connected. However, in a threatening experience, these 5 kinds of memory do not sufficiently connect, and that is called fragmentation. Fragmentation simply means that those 5 aspects of your memory remain largely separated from one another. Now, let me say that again because this is point number 1 for today. Fragmentation means that those 5 aspects of your memory are recorded in different regions of your brain, and they are not well connected with one another neuronally. In other words, the neurons corresponding to your feeling of fear are not well connected with the neurons corresponding to your thought, a dog is attacking me. Fragmentation means that your memory of the emotions you felt becomes separated from your memory of the thoughts you had. Fragmentation means that your memory of the bodily impulse to turn and run away becomes separated from your memory of the physical sensation of a tight chest. Fragmentation means that the neurons corresponding to your emotions and thoughts are also separated from the visual image of the dog's face as it is charging at you. All the various aspects of the memory become fragmented. They are separated from one another in your brain. To say it differently, in trauma, your emotions about the event do not get connected with your thoughts about the event, which do not get connected with the physical sensation of tightness in your chest. Here's how trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk puts it in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He says that when we experience something traumatic, the overwhelming experience becomes fragmented so that the emotions, sounds, images, thoughts, and physical sensations related to the trauma take on a life of their own. Now, that's a good way of saying it. In the wake of a traumatic event, the emotions associated with that event take on a life of their own. The physical sensations associated with that event, such as butterflies in your stomach or a tightness in your chest, those physical sensations take on a life of their own. When neurons are not sufficiently connected to other neurons, that is what we mean by fragmentation. Fragmentation is simply another way of saying separation, disconnection. In the aftermath of trauma, your brain will become more fragmented, which is to say, less integrated. The primary contribution that neuroscientist Dan Siegel has made to understanding trauma, and he's made a lot of them, but in my mind, the primary contribution that Dan Siegel has made to our understanding of trauma is his idea that brain health is a function of integration. In other words, the more connection between parts of your brain, between the neurons in your brain, the more they're connected with each other, the healthier your brain. A disconnected, fragmented brain is a traumatized brain. A connected, integrated brain is a healed brain. Now, it's important to note that this dog biting event does not have to traumatize you. Not all harmful events traumatize the brain. If your mother, in this story, runs over to you and gets the dog away from you and then comforts you in the midst of your fear, and if your mother helps you narrate the story of what happened, then mom's attunement and responsiveness and care and comfort and the safety that she creates in the aftermath of the dog biting, all of that allows your brain to link up those disconnected aspects of your memory. Yes, by receiving sufficient care in the immediate wake of a potentially traumatizing event, your brain is able to make sense of the story. And what that means neurobiologically is that your brain is able to integrate, connect the fragmented recordings of the memory. The neurons recording your thoughts about the event become sufficiently connected to the neurons recording your emotions about the event, which become connected to the neurons recording your physical sensations about the event. In this way, the story, the autobiographical narrative of what just happened to you becomes coherent, and your brain becomes integrated. Okay, that's what good care does. It allows the fragmented recordings in disparate parts of your brain to connect with one another and become integrated. So, point number one for today is simply this. Unprocessed trauma, i.e., when mom doesn't come over and care and comfort and help you make sense of the story, all right? When you are alone, when you are abandoned by potentially protective caregivers. So remember, trauma is two things: helplessness, the inability to use your voice or move your body in such a way to make the awful things stop happening. That's number one. And number two, abandonment by potentially protective caregivers. When those two things are there, you will experience trauma. So point number one for today is that unprocessed trauma leads to fragmentation. Now, the example I just gave was a one-time isolated incident. It happened one time to this 7-year-old. But what if the bad event is not an isolated incident? What if the bad thing happening actually happens with some frequency? And what if the bad thing happens at home with mom and dad rather than at the playground with a dog? In that case, you are in the realm of what's called developmental trauma. Consider the brain of a little girl. What might happen in the brain of a 5-year-old girl who sees her dad hit her mom? And then when this girl turns 10, she watches her parents go through a very bitter divorce. And then when this girl turns 15, her dad or her stepdad began making sexually suggestive comments about her body. What happens in her brain? Fragmented memory after fragmented memory after fragmented memory. Lots and lots of fragmentation in her brain. This girl becomes an adult, and she has an unintegrated jumble of thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, bodily inclinations, visual images. This girl becomes an adult, and she has a very fragmented brain. Which brings me to main point number 2. When you have high levels of fragmented memory in your brain due to trauma, your brain and your body will feel unstable. When you have a lot of fragmented memory recordings in your brain as a result of trauma, the ground beneath you does not feel solid. You feel a sense of instability. Another way of saying this, the world does not feel safe. Lots of fragmented memory means that you will go through your day with a felt sense that the ground beneath you is not solid. The world is not quite safe. Something bad might happen soon. Now look, you are not going to be aware of that as a 14-year-old girl, a 20-year-old man. All right, you're not necessarily going to be aware of that. Why? Because it's just the way it is for you. It's been normal for so long. But the reason you feel a little unstable inside, a little shaky, is because there are so many access points in your daily life for your trauma to be activated. What do I mean? Well, think about it. A snarling dog. Or someone's momentary facial expression of contempt, a coworker. But that facial expression is just like the one your dad had on his face right before he hit your mother. Or a particular thought or emotion inside. All of these reminders, memories, can activate the not safe system in your brain, the danger system. And when the not safe system is activated, you will experience intense reactions that may seem wildly out of proportion to the present circumstance. When you have a lot of fragmented memories inside, your life will feel chaotic at times. The felt sense of chaos is because there is not enough integration in your brain. There's not enough connection between your neurons. The neurons are fragmented and separated from each other. And what we know from complexity theory states, this is very important, that the most stable systems are those systems with high levels of differentiation and high levels of connection, both. In other words, the most stable brains, because your brain is the complex system par excellence, all right? The most stable brains are brains where the thoughts and the feelings and the physical sensations are differentiated from one another, yes, but are connected to one another. Deep neuronal, thick fibers of connections. That creates integration. That creates a felt sense of stability, which translates to a sense that the world is safe. The ground under your feet is solid. Now, main point number 3 for today. When your brain is fragmented and you feel chaotic inside, you will feel a tremendous pull to reduce that chaos with certainty. Let me say it again. When you feel chaotic inside as a result of fragmented memories, as a result of all the fragmentation in your brain due to trauma, due to your experiences growing up, and the inability to have any space or time or help processing them and making sense of all that stuff. Okay, when you feel the instability of that, the chaos of that, you will be very attracted to certainty. By certainty, I mean, I know what is happening in the world, and my perspective on all the important issues is right. I may not know everything, but I know some things, and the things that I know are right. And people who disagree with me about those things are wrong. Certainty. Certainty is the conviction that you know the truth with a capital T. Certainty reduces the felt experience of chaos and fragmentation in your brain. Why? Why? Because certainty gives you a sense of, okay, the ground beneath my feet is stable and solid. Let me give a personal example. As a sophomore in high school, I had a very fragmented brain, lots of trauma. Nothing soothed my feeling of chaos inside more than what I heard at church and what I read in my Christian books. The pastor offered me certainty about some very important categories, such as the reason the world is so broken is because of sin. The God of the Bible is in control. Jesus has rescued the world from sin. If I trust and obey God, I can experience healing from my pain and abundant life. When I die, I will go to heaven and be free from all shame and sorrow. It was very soothing to my fragmented brain to hear those things week in and week out. Why? Why? Because everyone in the church, my community, was absolutely certain about those things. Certainty makes your fragmented and chaotic brain feel more stable. Certainty imposes a structure on the unpredictable world that seems to reduce the chaos. And in this way, certainty functions in place of the impaired brain function of integrating the traumatic fragments. It functions in that way. It helps with that. Here's how Dan Allender puts it. This is just so concise and so helpful. And I'm going to refer to this phrase a number of times. Dan Allender says, the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. Now that is a very good sentence. The more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. So think about someone with a lot of fragmentation in their brain as a result of trauma. That person is going to crave certainty. When you've experienced trauma and there's lots of fragmentation in your brain, you will be very attracted to certainty. That is, you will be very attracted to belief systems that help your brain feel more orderly, safe, stable, secure, less chaotic. Why? Because, as Dan said, the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. So go back to the girl who experienced all those traumas at age 5, 10, 15. Suppose that girl grows up and begins attending church with a friend in college. As she hears the pastor speak week in and week out, as the pastor offers this woman an explanation of why bad things happen in the world, why she has trouble with her emotions and trouble with her relationships, and what God has done about all of this by sending Jesus. As the pastor shares these things, how are the pastor's words going to feel to her fragmented brain, to her sense of chaos inside? They will be, the pastor's words will be incredibly soothing. The pastor's words will soothe her fragmented brain. Why? Because the pastor is offering a certainty to a brain that feels uncertain and confused. To this young woman's brain, hearing the pastor's teaching week in and week out will feel like the shaky ground beneath her feet is not as shaky anymore. Certainty makes traumatized people feel safer in the world. Certainty soothes fragmented brains. When your brain is in a chaotic state as a result of fragmentation from trauma, there is immense pressure to figure out a way to make order out of the chaos inside. And a theological system, any theological system, reduces chaos by offering certainty. Dan Allender was interviewed on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I think it was like episode 20. And during that interview, Dan explained that one of the reasons that Mark Driscoll's church grew like gangbusters was because it, quote, offered highly traumatized people a place where they could be at rest. Now that is such a good sentence. Why were so many people drawn to a deeply narcissistic and abusive pastor? Why? There's a reason for it. It wasn't a fluke. Because traumatized people have a high degree of fragmentation in their brains, which makes you feel chaotic and unstable inside. And all of that discomfort is soothed by theological certainty. When a traumatized person is offered theological certainty, they can finally begin to experience some rest inside. This is exactly what Christianity did for me when I was in high school. Now, by the way, please hear me well. I am not saying that Christianity is wrong. Just bear with me for a minute. I'm not saying that. What Christianity did for me in high school, this is important, It offered rest to my fragmented, traumatized, chaotic brain. So I'm not saying that it was wrong for me to dive so deeply into my Christian faith in high school. By no means. I'm so proud of what happened. I'm so proud of the development of my faith in high school and college. I am, however, saying that the reason I found Christianity so appealing was because the theological certainty of evangelical Christianity was very calming for my fragmented and unstable brain. The theological certainty of evangelical Christianity, which is what I grew up in, it was very calming for my fragmented state. In other words, it gave me rest. It gave me a sense of rest. And that's why I read those books. That's why I had all those quiet times. It was an attempt at self-regulation. So here's my claim. For people with a history of trauma, we tend to think that we use reason and logic to choose our theological beliefs. But, in fact, what's really driving us is desperation to find rest from the fragmentation and chaos inside. A desperate attempt to find some solid ground on which we can base our life. Please hear me well. I am not saying that this is true for securely attached people. I'm not saying that this is the case for people who have not experienced developmental trauma. The brains of those folks are not nearly as fragmented and chaotic as the brains of people who have developmental trauma. But for those of us who have fragmented, traumatized brains, we naturally gravitate toward belief systems that offer certainty. A particular theological system appeals to us first and foremost because it regulates our dysregulated bodies. And how does it do that? It offers us certainty about the world. And remember Dan's words, the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. So people with a history of trauma will gravitate toward a theology that offers certainty, because a theology that offers certainty soothes the dysregulation and fragmentation and chaos that we feel inside. This does not mean your theology is wrong. By no means. It simply means that some part of your embrace of that theology is because it calms your insides, rather than because you have dispassionately evaluated the theology with reason and logic. We all have hidden persuaders. Now, final point for today. Point number 4, and this is what I was building towards. When you are driven by fragmentation to embrace theological certainty as a means of soothing, a means of stability, you will invariably become a dogmatic person. To say it differently, the fragmentation in your traumatized brain is soothed by certainty, and there is no way you are going to let anyone take that certainty away from you. Thus, you become dogmatic about your beliefs. Now, what do I mean by dogmatic? Okay, to be dogmatic is to wholeheartedly embrace a belief system as true with a capital T. Said another way, to be dogmatic is to think that the opinions you hold are incontrovertible facts. What makes someone dogmatic is not what they believe. It's that they are certain that whatever they believe is right and that those who disagree with them are wrong. Dogmatism is, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and I'm 100% certain of it. Okay, I said all of that to say this. Dogmatism is not driven by analytic, left brain, logical thinking. Dogmatism is driven by a fragmented, chaotic right brain that needs certainty to calm itself down. Let me repeat that. Dogmatism is not driven by analytic, left brain, logical thinking. It's driven by a fragmented, chaotic right brain that needs certainty to calm itself down. The soothing of the fragmentation in your brain is not so much a function of what you believe. It's far more a function of the certainty with which you believe it. For a fragmented, chaotic brain, it matters less what you believe. What matters the most is the certainty with which you believe it. So, think of the people in your world who are very dogmatic, very rigid in their thinking, very certain of their theological convictions. What if these people simply have a high level of fragmentation in their brains due to trauma? And what if their theological certainty is an attempt to soothe that fragmentation, to make their brains feel and bodies feel more stable? This is why it is so difficult for these folks to consider viewpoints that are different from their own. It's not so much that these people are closed-minded or narcissistic. It's that they are trying to prevent their brains from fragmenting. They are trying to protect themselves from feeling unstable and chaotic inside. Remember Dan's words, the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. No one arrives at their theological and political beliefs solely by objectively weighing the merits of various theological or political positions. No one. You come to your theological and political viewpoints in response to your story. So, question for you. Have you ever truly considered the words of someone who disagreed with you about something that was really important to you? Perhaps someone who is challenging your theological or political views. All right, have you ever just really considered their point of view? If you have, do you remember what happened inside your body when you allowed yourself to try on what they were saying? In other words, what happened inside your body when you allowed yourself to truly consider, oh, what if they're right and I'm actually wrong about this issue? Now, whenever I do this exercise, whenever I let myself do this on some big issue that's really important to me, I immediately feel some measure of fear and disorientation inside my body. As I consider, what if they are right about this and I've been wrong about this issue my whole life? As I consider that, it feels shaky inside. Suddenly, I feel less certain about my position, and that loss of certainty sends me back to the chaotic feeling of fragmentation. All of a sudden, it feels a little less stable inside. Now look, I am not advocating relativism, okay? If you've gone there in your brain as you're listening, I'm not advocating that. What's relativism? Relativism says it doesn't matter what you believe. All faith claims are equally valid, that sort of thing. I'm not advocating that. The opposite of dogmatism is not relativism. The opposite of dogmatism is openness to the stories of others. And that's what I'm advocating. Openness to the stories of others. The opposite of dogmatism Dogmatism is I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm 100% sure of it. All right. The opposite of dogmatism, it is not relativism. It's not all faith claims are equally valid. Doesn't matter what you believe. No, the opposite of dogmatism is openness to the stories of others. So at least two takeaways for today. Number one, I want you to find compassion for your dogmatic friends, colleagues, coworkers, family members. I'm not saying you should agree with them. I'm not saying you should stop arguing with them. But how might your posture toward them change? How might it change if Jesus came down and said, look, that person who disagrees so vehemently with you and who is so supremely certain about their theological convictions and their political opinions, that person is simply trying to soothe the fragmentation in their brains so that they feel safer in a scary world. What if Jesus came down and said that to you? How would your posture toward that person change if you realized that their dogmatism was actually a desperate attempt to feel safe in the world? That their dogmatic viewpoints were held in place because their brain needs a sense of certainty to soothe the fragmentation and chaos they feel inside. Takeaway number 2 for today. I want you to understand yourself and to have compassion on yourself. Perhaps you know that you are rather dogmatic about certain things. What if your absolute certainty about this issue or that issue is not so much driven by reason and logic as by your attempt to reduce the chaos and fragmentation in your brain? The more you heal from trauma, the less you will need to be certain about everything. This doesn't mean you won't have strong theological or political convictions. You can still feel very passionately about issues that are important to you. But you will be free to truly consider alternative viewpoints, which is to say, you will be open to the stories of those you disagree with. When someone's vehement disagreement with you no longer threatens your peace, you can open yourself to them while remaining stable and grounded. And you will understand what's really driving some of the people who disagree so vehemently with you. Okay, let me briefly summarize the main points of this episode, and then I want to say something at the end that's very important to me and is pastoral. Let me summarize the episode. Point number 1, trauma leads to fragmentation. Point number 2, when you have high levels of fragmentation in your brain due to trauma, your brain and body will feel unstable. Point 3, because of this felt sense of instability, you will feel a tremendous pull toward theologies and worldviews that offer certainty. And point number 4, as a result, the fragmentation in your brain due to trauma can make you a very dogmatic person. Why? Because, as Dan says, the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel. Certainty soothes the fragmentation in our brains as a result of trauma. All right, that's a summary of today. Now, some pastoral words as we end. The Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf says that Christianity is the difference between I hold and I am held. Boy, do I love that. Christianity is the difference between I hold and I am held. What he means by that is that the more you grow in Christ, the more you will realize that it doesn't matter so much what faith claims you hold. What matters ultimately is that you are held by God. It is far less about you and far more about God. For those of us with a history of trauma, we will invariably be tempted toward dogmatism, which means that we will be closed to the stories of those we disagree with unless the fragmentation in our brains is soothed not by certainty, but by the deep knowing that we are held by God. Even if we're wrong on some important point, that we are held by God. For those of us with a history of trauma, we will invariably become dogmatic people, close to the stories of those we disagree with, unless the fragmentation in our brains is soothed not by certainty, but by the deep knowing that we are held by God. May it be so. Thank you so much for listening.